"Are you married?" the voice below him shouted, and the Duke of Ilverdon nearly lost his footing on the wet slate. He caught the ridge board, steadied the sheet of lead under his knee, and looked down through the scaffolding poles at a young woman standing in the churchyard grass with her bonnet ribbons come loose and her skirts dark to the knee with dew. She was shouting up at him as though he were a servant who had not heard her the first time. "I asked," she called again, cupping her hands, "whether you are married, and if you are not, whether you would like to be. Today, if it can be managed. Tomorrow at the very latest." He set down the mallet. In 34 years, no one had ever proposed to him from the bottom of a ladder, and he found, with some interest in his own reaction, that he did not dislike it. "Are you unwell?" he called back, because it seemed the more urgent question. "I am entirely well. I am simply out of time." She shaded her eyes against the gray morning light. "I have 11 days, sir, and no husband in them, and you are the only unmarried man I have found this week who was not already spoken for by someone with better sense than I have. So, are you married?" "No," he said. "Would you like to be?" He looked down at her a long moment, at the set of her jaw, which was doing a great deal of work to keep the rest of her face from trembling, and at her hands, which were not steady at all. Whatever this was, it was not a jest, or not only a jest. A woman did not come to a churchyard at 8 in the morning and shout a proposal at a stranger on a roof unless the ground behind her had already given way. "Come down," she added, when he did not answer at once, "so that I am not obliged to conduct my courtship at this volume. The sexton's wife already thinks me mad, and she is not wrong, but I should rather she did not have it confirmed from the belfry." He was, by any account that mattered in the wider world, the Duke of Ilverdon, a title that owned more sheep than most counties own people, and a house 3 days' hard riding to the north that was more scaffolding than roof, much like the one he stood on now. But he had learned years ago that a coat of rough wool and a mallet in his hand made him invisible in a way his rank never could. And invisibility, this particular week, in this particular parish, suited him very well. He had come down from London by way of business. He had told no one of business that had brought him to Draycott Renshaw, and was none of this girl's concern. And finding the church sexton laid up with a wrenched back and rain coming, he had simply climbed the ladder himself rather than watch the man's roof leak onto his prayer books. It was easier than explaining who he was. It was always easier than explaining who he was. He came down the ladder rung by rung, slate dust falling from his shoulders, and stood before her on the grass. Close to, she was younger than her voice had suggested, 23, perhaps, with a sharp, clever face and eyes, red-rimmed from crying that she had plainly decided, by main force of will, to stop doing. 11 days, he said. For what? For my mother's wedding, which is also, unfortunately, mine or as good as, since I am the payment. She said it lightly, the way a person says the worst thing they know when they have practiced saying it lightly so many times that the practice has become a kind of armor. My mother owes a debt to Mr. Pentland Vale. He is 50 years old, and he collects debts the way other men collect snuff-boxes, and he has decided that the cleanest way to collect this one is to marry into the family that owes it. Not my mother, she is too old and too poor to interest him beyond her signature. Me. There is a settlement drawn already. The banns will be read a second time this Sunday. In 11 days I am to be Mrs. Pentland Vale, and my mother is to be safe from the sponging house, and everyone is to call it a very sensible arrangement. And you do not find it sensible? I find it, she said, the way I would find drowning sensible if drowning kept the roof on. I have tried 3 respectable ways out of it already. They have all failed, which is why I am standing in wet grass proposing to a man I found on a ladder, and I would take it as a very great kindness if you did not make me explain myself twice." He should have laughed. Any reasonable man would have laughed, made her a small bow, and gone back up the ladder to finish before the rain came in earnest. Instead, he found himself studying her face for the lie in it, and finding none, only a fear so carefully governed that it had nowhere left to go but into recklessness. "What is your name?" he said. "Sibylla Renshaw." She lifted her chin, as if daring him to find the name absurd, coming as it did from a girl proposing marriage in a churchyard. "Miss Sibylla Renshaw, of no fortune, no father living, and as of 11 days from now, unless something remarkable happens, no say whatsoever in the shape of the rest of my life." Renshaw. The name went through him like a hand closing round something he had been carrying carefully for 300 miles, and for one unguarded instant his face must have shown it, because she frowned and said, "You know the name." "I know a great many names," he said, which was true and told her nothing, and he was aware even as he said it that it was the first small dishonesty of what would prove, in time, to be a very large one. "Why me? You do not know me. I might be married in Yorkshire for all you can tell, or wanted for debt, or worse." "You might," she agreed, "but you came down the ladder. Every other man in this churchyard this morning found urgent business at the far end of it the moment I opened my mouth. You did not." She looked at him, really looked, the way people rarely troubled to look at a man in a laborer's coat, past the wet wool and the dust to whatever it was underneath that had made him climb down at all. "That is not nothing, sir. In my present circumstances it is very nearly everything." Somewhere behind her, in the lane beyond the lich gate, a cart-wheel ground on the wet stones, and the church clock began with a wheeze to strike the half-hour. 11 days. He did the arithmetic without meaning to, how many of those days he had already spent, how many remained before the business that had brought him to this parish would resolve itself one way or another, whether it resolved before or after Mr. Pentland Vale read a second set of banns over this girl's bowed head. "Come out of the wet," he said at last, nodding toward the lich gate and the dry stone bench beneath it, "and tell me the whole of it. Not the version you shout at strangers on ladders. All of it, your mother, this veil, the debt, the 11 days. If I am to be asked to marry a woman before Sunday next, Miss Renshaw, I find I should like to know rather more than her name." She stared at him, at the "if," which he had not meant to make sound so much like a promise, and which she had heard unmistakably as one. "You would," she said slowly, wonderingly, as though the ground had shifted and not yet finished shifting, "actually consider it." He did not answer that directly. He only held out his arm, dust and all, toward the dry bench, and waited to see whether she trusted him enough to take it. A stranger off a roof, in a parish he had come to for reasons he had no intention yet of naming, with 11 days now measured against a clock that was no longer entirely hers. She took it. Her fingers were cold through her glove, and she noticed him noticing, and drew her hand back the moment they reached the bench, as if she had already given away more than the arrangement warranted. "You should know," she said, sitting with her spine very straight, the posture of a woman determined not to be pitied, "that I am not a romantic fool. I do not imagine you will fall in love with me between now and Sunday, nor I with you. I am not looking for a husband who will make me happy. I am looking for one who will make Mr. Vale's claim on me void before the second reading of the banns, and who will not, having done so, beat me, starve me, or sell what little I bring with me. That is the whole of my requirement. It is not much to ask of a stranger, and it is everything I have to offer one." "That is a very small ambition," he said, "for a woman who shouted at a roof." "I have learned to keep my ambition small. Large ones get noticed, and noticed things get stopped." She glanced sideways at him, at the dust on his coat, and the calluses plain across his knuckles where he had let go of the bench rail. "You are not, I think, a man of great means, or you would not be up on a church roof in the rain mending another man's lead flashing. That suits me. Mr. Vale has means enough for both of us, and it has bought my mother nothing but fear. I would rather have a poor man's honesty than a rich man's ledger." He said nothing to that, though the words sat oddly against everything he was, and everything 3 counties of tenants believed him to be, and he told himself the omission was a small one, easily corrected later, when there was less at stake in her believing otherwise. "Tell me of your mother," he said instead. "Start there. I find I want the whole shape of it before I answer you, and not the shouted version." "The whole shape of it," she said, "is that my father is 5 years dead and left us less than anyone supposed, and my mother is a gentle, frightened woman who signed a note to Mr. Vale 2 winters ago believing he was a friend of my father's, and has been paying for that belief every quarter since with interest she does not understand and cannot meet. 3 weeks ago he called the whole of it due at once, and named his price for forgiving it, and it was me." Her voice did not break, though it came close, a hairline crack quickly mortared over. "She wept for 2 days and then began ordering my bride clothes, because she could see no other road, and I love her too well to let her walk it alone into that man's house." The bell above them fell silent. Rain had begun in earnest now, fine and cold, beating on his sleeve and on the dark wool of her cloak, and neither of them moved toward shelter. 11 days, he said again, turning the number over like a coin whose weight he did not yet trust. 11 days, she agreed, and one stranger on a ladder who did not run. "What will you do," he said, "if I say no?" It was not the question he had meant to ask. He had meant to ask about Vale, the man's standing, his temper, whether there was some cousin, some magistrate, some ordinary door through which this girl might have walked instead of a churchyard. But the question that came out of him was the one that mattered, and he watched it land on her like cold water. "I will find someone else," she said, too quickly, and then more honestly, "I do not know who. There is no one else. I have asked the curate at Nether Cole, who is promised to a rector's daughter, and I have asked my cousin Ferris, who laughed until he could not stand, and I have asked—" She stopped. "Go on." "I have asked whether a woman may simply refuse, stand up in the church itself when the banns are read and say she will not have him. I am told it can be done. I am told also that my mother would then owe the whole debt within the month, with no husband's protection against Mr. Vale's collectors, and that the sponging house does not care for a lady's delicate nerves." Her hands, folded in her lap, had gone white at the knuckle. "So no, I will not simply refuse. If you say no to me, sir, I expect I shall go home and put on the bride clothes my mother is sewing, and I shall marry Mr. Pentland Vale in 11 days. And I shall manage it the way women have always managed such things, by not thinking about it very much, and by being very good at pretending afterward that it does not hurt." He did not like the answer. He had asked for the truth and been given it plainly, without the theatrics she might reasonably have used to move him, and it moved him a great deal more for their absence. "You would go through with it," he said, "knowing what he is." "I do not know what he is precisely. I know what he does. He calls in debts before they are ripe and calls them love of order. He has buried 2 wives, both of whom brought him money, and there is talk nothing that could be proved, only talk that neither death grieved him over long." She met his eyes, unflinching, though something in her voice had gone very careful, the tone of a woman handling a blade by the wrong end, because it is the only end available to her. "I am 23, sir. I am not a green girl who believes marriage is a fairy story. I know precisely what I am walking into. I intend to walk into it with my eyes open, because the alternative is watching my mother taken up for debt, and I find I cannot do that and call myself her daughter afterward." He looked away from her, out across the wet churchyard, at the leaning stones and the yew gone black with rain, and thought of his own inheritance. A house with half its roof gone and 600 souls who had trusted a dead man's promises and been left, when that man died, with nothing but debts dressed up as an estate. He knew something of what it was to stand between people you loved and a ruin not of your making. He had not expected to find the same knowledge in a stranger's face, in a country churchyard 300 miles from home. Why not simply ask him for time, he said. Vale, men who collect debts for sport can sometimes be made to see reason if the reason is dressed correctly. We tried that. My mother went to him herself in April and asked for a 12-month. He gave her a fortnight and raised the interest and told her. Sibylla's mouth thinned. He told her that a man in his position did not lend patience, only money, and that if she wanted patience she ought to have married better the first time. My mother came home and did not speak for 2 days. That is when I understood there would be no reasoning with him, and that whatever was to be done, I should have to do it myself, quickly, and without asking anyone's permission first. So you went looking for a husband the way another woman might go looking for a solicitor. I went looking, she said, with the ghost of the humor that must, in a kinder week, have been more often on her face, for the fastest respectable exit from a burning house. I did not expect to find him up a ladder. I confess I had rather hoped for someone with a horse and a superior coat, who might sweep me off somewhere further than 3 counties away, and make the whole business feel less like a transaction. But the fire does not wait for a man's coat to improve, sir, and neither, I find, do I. He almost told her then. The words were there, close behind his teeth, that he had a great deal more than a horse, that the coat was a disguise and not a circumstance, that he could end this with a signature and a purse, and never need to marry anyone at all. But something stopped him. Some instinct he did not examine closely enough in that moment to name, and what he said instead was smaller, and, he would later think, far more dangerous than the truth would have been. And if I say yes, he said, what then? What do you imagine our marriage looks like, the morning after the wedding you are proposing? I imagine, she said, that you go back to whatever work keeps you on ladders, and I keep your house, such as it is, and we are civil to one another. And Mr. Vale's claim on my family dies the moment the register is signed, because a married woman's debts are her husband's to refuse, and he will not go on collecting from a duchess's. She caught herself, laughed once, short and startled at her own slip of the tongue. From a poor man's wife, when there is nothing left in it for him. That is all I imagine. I have not thought past the wedding itself. I have been too occupied surviving the 11 days to plan the 12th. He watched her laugh at her own joke and thought, with a clarity that unsettled him more than the churchyard's cold had, that he wanted very much to be the man who gave her a 12th day worth planning for, and that he had, in the space of one wet morning, gone from a stranger on a ladder to a man calculating, with real and frightening seriousness, how quickly a license might be got. There is a difficulty, he said slowly. Bans will not serve. You have not 11 days to spare for a public reading 3 Sundays running, and I will not stand up in a church and be gossiped over before this is settled. It would have to be a license. A special one, if we are quick, and I know the right door to knock on. You know a door that grants special licenses. Her eyes narrowed slightly, quick and clever even through her fear. That is not the sort of door a poor man generally knows the number of. I have done a service or 2 for men who owed me favors, he said, which was, again, entirely true, and told her almost nothing. It is not so strange. A man on a roof may still know a bishop's secretary, Miss Renshaw, if the roof he mended once happened to belong to the bishop's cousin. It was thin, and he knew it was thin even as he said it, and he watched her decide, visibly, deliberately, the way a person decides to step onto ice they have already heard crack once. not to examine it further, because examining it further meant asking questions she could not presently afford the answers to costing her. "Then say yes," she said, very low, "or say no, sir, because the rain is coming through my cloak, and I have a mother at home who thinks I have gone to fetch thread." He rose from the bench. Somewhere behind the church wall, a rook complained at the weather, and the license he had just half promised her sat in his chest like a stone dropped into still water, the rings of it spreading out further than he could yet see. "Yes," he said. She went very still. "You will want my name for the paper," she said at last, faintly. "You have not asked it, not the whole of it, parish, father's name, all of that. A license wants particulars." "I will want them," he agreed, "but not this morning. This morning I want you to go home, Miss Renshaw, and say nothing to anyone, not your mother, not a servant, not the sexton's wife who already thinks you mad. Because a secret told twice by Sunday is a secret Mr. Vale will hear by Monday, and I should like this managed before he does." "You sound," she said slowly, watching his face with new and unwelcome attention, "like a man who has arranged a great many things quietly before." He did not answer that either. He only bowed slightly, dust falling from his shoulder as he did, and turned back toward the ladder still propped against the church wall, leaving her standing in the wet grass with a yes she had not quite expected to receive, and a stranger's face she found, walking home through the lane a quarter-hour later, she could not entirely put out of her mind. He watched her go as far as the lich-gate, cloak dark and heavy with rain, shoulders set the way, a soldier's were set on the march into whether he could not change. Then he climbed the ladder again, because the lead would not lay itself, and because a man thinks more clearly with his hands occupied than with them idle at his sides. He had come to Draycott Renshaw on an errand of his own, private, and not yet finished, that had nothing to do, or so he had believed until an hour ago, with any Renshaw daughter shouting from a churchyard wall. There was a letter in his breast pocket, folded twice, that he had carried 300 miles and had not yet delivered to the man it named, and a promise made years before to someone who could no longer collect on it himself. He had meant to see the whole matter settled quietly and be gone north again within the week, a stranger no one in the parish would trouble to remember. He told himself, laying slate in the thin rain with more force than the work required, that a hasty marriage changed nothing about that other errand, that the two things could run on side by side without touching, like two roads that happened to cross the same county. He told himself this several times, in fact, which was generally, in his experience, a reliable sign that a thing was not true. The bishop's secretary, a dry, careful man named Mr. Otterburn, who had once owed his continued employment to a quiet word from the Duke of Ilverdon, did not ask why his grace required a special license made out in a laborer's coat with slate dust still under his fingernails. He asked only two questions, the bride's name, and whether his grace wished the document to bear his title or merely his Christian name, and such surname as he cared to use. And when the answer to the second question came back plain and flat, he did not so much as raise an eyebrow. "Cuthbert only," the Duke said. "No style, she does not know it, and I have not yet decided when she is to." "As your grace wishes." Otterburn dipped his pen. "It is irregular." "Everything about this week is irregular, Otterburn. Write it as I say." He rode the 11 miles back to Draycott Renshaw, with the license folded inside his coat, next to the other letter he had not yet delivered, and told himself the two papers sat easily enough together, though something in his chest disagreed with the arithmetic every time the horse's stride jolted them against his ribs. He found Sibylla in the lane behind the mill, exactly where her note 3 lines, unsigned, left with the sexton's boy, had said she would be at noon. She had brought no maid, no chaperone, only a basket she was ostensibly filling with early greens as cover for standing about in a public lane waiting for a man she had known one day. "You came," she said, and there was real astonishment in it, quickly smoothed over. "I said I would." Men say a great many things at 8 in the morning that do not survive until noon. She glanced past him at the horse, a good deal finer than a mender of church roofs generally rode, and something flickered across her face, a question forming, before she visibly set it aside, too occupied with the larger crisis to spend attention on the smaller puzzle. "Well, have you the license, or must we still contrive one?" He drew it from his coat and let her see the corner of it, not the whole, and watched relief break over her face like sun through cloud. "Tuesday," he said. "I can have it by Tuesday. That gives us 2 days to arrange the rest at church, a rector willing to marry a stranger on short notice, witnesses who will hold their tongues until it is done." "Rector Bray will do it," she said at once. "He christened me. He buried my father. He will ask questions, but he will ask them after the register is signed, not before, if I tell him it is a matter of saving my mother, which is no more than the truth." She was already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead, the fear in her replaced for the moment by the fierce, practical energy of a woman who had finally been handed something to do. Witnesses, the sexton, perhaps, and his wife, though she will talk. My mother must not know until it is done, or she will weep and forbid it and ruin everything trying to protect me from a decision that is mine to make. That is the hard part. I do not like deceiving her." "Then do not think of it as deceiving her," he said. "Think of it as sparing her a choice she is not strong enough to make and would only suffer for making." She looked at him sharply, as though the sentence had cost him something to say, and she had heard the cost in it, though she could not have said what debt of his own experience he was drawing on when he said it. Tuesday was 2 days off, and those 2 days ran together afterward in his memory as a blur of small, absurd logistics that would have been comic in any other week. A ring had to be got, quietly, from a jeweler in the market town 12 miles off, and he chose a plain band, because a grand one would have asked questions a plain one would not. A gown had to be not got, since there was no time and no money that Sibylla was willing to admit to having, and she settled the matter herself by declaring she would be married in her second-best walking dress and daring anyone, including him, to object. He spent an afternoon convincing Hob Silito, his own foreman, sent ahead days before on other business and found, by unlucky chance, taking a pint at the village inn to hold his tongue about who exactly his master was, a conversation that involved more plain speaking, and one nearly overturned tankard than he cared to repeat. "You are marrying her," Hob had said, flat with disbelief, "under a false name in a false coat, and you have not told her what she's getting." "I have told her everything that matters. I have not told her the parts that do not." "That is a fine distinction to make from where you're standing, your grace, and a poor one to make from where she's standing, when she finds it out." He had not liked hearing it from Hob's mouth any better than he liked it now, turning it over on his own, riding back from the jeweler's with a ring small enough to hide in a closed fist. But he told himself there would be time, after the wedding, to set it right in his own way, to tell her the whole of it when the danger from Vale had passed, and the telling could not be mistaken for a threat. And he believed this the way a man believes a bridge will hold simply, because he has not yet fallen through it. There was Rector Bray to be managed as well, and he proved a harder study than either the ring or the foreman. He was an old man, spare and shrewd behind small spectacles, who had buried Sibylla's father and christened Sibylla herself, and he did not so much agree to marry a stranger to his late friend's daughter as consent to be persuaded, slowly, over the course of a long evening in his cold little study. "You will not tell me your surname," Bray said, turning the license over in his hands as though it might yield the answer on its own if he looked at it long enough, "nor your parish, nor your father's condition in life. That is a great deal for a rector to swallow on a stranger's word, sir, even in aid of a girl I have known from her cradle." "I have told you what bears on the marriage," the Duke said, "that I am unmarried of age and able to provide for her. The rest is my own business, and I give you my word for whatever a stranger's word is worth to you that it does her no dishonor." "Words are cheap from men in fine linen shirts under laborers' coats," Bray said mildly, and the Duke went very still, and the old rector allowed himself a thin, satisfied smile at having noticed what he was clearly not meant to. "I do not know what you are, sir, nor do I much care to guess before I must. But I have watched that child go pale and thin these 3 months past, weighing a marriage that would have broken her, and I have prayed a good many nights for some door to open that was not the one Mr. Vale was holding. I do not think it my place to slam it shut again for want of a surname." He set the license down. "I will marry you tomorrow, and I will ask my questions after, and God help you, sir, if the answers shame her." It was as near to a blessing as the Duke expected to receive from anyone that week, and it cost him more composure than he cared to admit to have it granted by a country rector, who had seen through the coat in a single evening when Sibylla herself, sharper by far, had not yet thought to look. Word travels fast in a parish the size of Draycott-Renshaw, faster still when the word concerns a debtor's daughter and a license bought in the market town, and by Monday evening it had reached the one house it was never meant to reach at all. He learned of it from Sibylla herself, white-faced, meeting him at the lane behind the mill an hour after dark. Having slipped out under cover of mending linen, she had told her mother she meant to return to a neighbor. "Vale knows," she said without preamble. "Not everything. He does not know your name, thank God, only that I have been seen twice with a stranger and that a license has been bought in the town. But he came to the house tonight before supper and told my mother that if the second reading of the banns is not made good by the date agreed, he will consider the arrangement broken by our side, and the whole debt due within the week, the whole of it, at once, with no more talk of marriage to soften it." Her hands, gripping the basket handle, were shaking badly enough now that she set it down rather than let him see it. "He as good as told her he would rather ruin us outright than be made a fool of waiting. He suspects something, sir. I do not know what he means to do before Tuesday, only that he means to do something, and I am afraid." The Duke of Ilverdon looked down at her in the dark lane, at the fear she had kept so carefully leashed for 2 days now breaking loose at last, and felt something harden in him that had nothing to do with the estate 3 counties north, or the debts he had come south to settle. "Then we need not wait a moment longer than we already have," he said. "We are married tomorrow, as arranged. Vale may suspect a great deal between now and morning. He will not be able to prove a word of it before the register is signed." Rain came down on the church roof he had mended not 4 days before, and the Duke of Ilverdon stood at the chancel step listening to it drum against the new lead flashing and thought, with a grim private humor, that at least the bride would not be married under a leak. 9 people stood in the cold nave to see it done. Rector Bray, in his surplice, spectacles beaded with damp. The sexton and his wife, pressed into service as witnesses, the wife's eyes bright with a curiosity she was too well-mannered to voice aloud, though it was plainly killing her to hold it in. Hob Silito, arms folded at the back, wearing the expression of a man watching a wager he strongly advised against being placed anyway. Mrs. Renshaw, small and pale in her best gray gown, brought at last into her daughter's confidence only that morning and still, by the look of her, not entirely recovered from the telling. And Sibylla, she had married him, as promised, in her second-best walking dress, a soft blue wool gone dark at the hem where she had walked through the wet lane to reach the church, with no flowers and no lace, and her hair pinned by her own hand rather than a maid's, because there had been no time to send for one without the whole village hearing of it first. She looked, he thought, watching her come up the short aisle on no one's arm because there was no one left to give her, entirely unlike a bride and entirely like herself, frightened and defiant, and holding her chin at an angle that dared the rain, the debt, and the whole conspiring world to make her cry before it was done. Her mother's face, when Sibylla reached the chancel step, was doing several things at once. Grief for a wedding that ought to have had more warning and more joy in it, relief so profound it looked almost like pain, and underneath both, a mother's plain terror that she was watching her only daughter marry a stranger to save her, and that the saving might yet cost more than either of them understood. Mr. Pentland Vale was not among the 9, but the Duke, glancing once toward the church door as Bray opened his book, saw a shape pause there in the rain, a tall man in a good dark coat, come, evidently, to see with his own eyes whether the rumor that had reached him last night was truth or a girl's desperate bluff. He did not come in. He stood in the porch a moment, out of the wet but not out of sight, and the Duke watched Sibylla's spine go rigid as she, too, caught the shape of him from the corner of her eye and understood exactly who had come to watch. "Dearly beloved," Rector Bray began, and did not hurry, though every soul in the church save perhaps the sexton's wife would have been glad of speed. The Duke made his vows in a voice pitched low and even, the voice of a man who had given orders to 600 tenants and never once needed to raise it to be obeyed, and he was aware, saying the words, of a strange and unfamiliar gravity settling over him, that he had meant, at 8 o'clock 4 mornings past, to treat this whole business as a kindness extended and quickly discharged, a debt of decency paid to a girl in trouble, and that somewhere between the churchyard and the chancel it had stopped feeling like that entirely. Sibylla's voice, when her turn came, shook only once on the word obey, which she said as though testing whether the church roof might fall in protest, and did not falter again after. He set the ring on her finger plain gold, small enough that it had needed no adjusting, a mercy he had not planned for and was grateful for now, and felt her hand tremble in his, cold despite the crowded, breath-warmed air of the nave, and closed his fingers briefly over hers before letting go, a gesture that was not in the service, and that Rector Bray, watching over his spectacles, noted with visible and private satisfaction. "I pronounce that they be man and wife together," Bray said at last, and closed his book, and in the porch, unseen by all but the Duke, the shape in the dark coat turned and walked away into the rain without waiting to see the rest. The register lay open on the small table by the vestry door, ink pot and pen set beside it, and it was here, in the last few minutes of the whole strange business, when the Duke had thought the danger of discovery well behind him, that the thing he had not planned for finally came to pass. Sibylla signed first, her hand steadier now the words were said, and could not be unsaid. Sibylla Renshaw for the last time in her life, the letters careful and a little too large, as though she wanted no one ever to be able to claim the signature had been coerced from a trembling hand. Then it was his turn, and he took up the pen, and for one long moment stood with the nib hovering over the page, aware of Bray watching him with the particular stillness of a man who has already half guessed what is coming, and is waiting, with some private relish, to see it confirmed. He wrote his Christian name plainly enough, Cuthbert, and then, because a license bought under a false economy of names was one thing, and a parish register was quite another, because a signature in a church register was a legal instrument that would not bear a lie sitting inside it forever, and because some stubborn, buried piece of him could not, in the end, bring himself to forge his own wedding. He wrote, beneath it, the only surname the law actually recognized him by. Ilverdon. He set down the pen. Behind him, Sibylla was already turning toward her mother, toward the small, damp, overwhelming business of having just been married, and did not so much as glance at the page. But Rector Bray did. The old man leaned in to blot the ink, as was his habit, and his eyes went to the second signature, and the Duke watched a species of recognition move slowly, and then very suddenly across the rector's face. The widening of the eyes, the sharp intake of breath, the color draining, and then rushing back into his weathered cheeks all at once. Rector Bray sat down. Not gracefully, not by design, his knees simply gave, and he lowered himself onto the vestry stool as though the floor of his own church had tilted underneath him. The register still open on the table, the second signature drying in the cool air, plain and unmistakable and entirely, catastrophically legible to any man in England who had ever read a peerage. Rector Sibylla turned back, frowning, alarmed by the sudden gray cast of his face. "Are you unwell? Shall I fetch water?" "No," Bray said faintly, not looking at her, looking instead at the man who had just married her, with an expression that was equal parts astonishment and something that might, in time, resolve itself into laughter. "No, child, I do not think water will serve for what ails me just at present." The Duke of Ilverdon met the old man's eyes over Sibylla's bowed head, and lifted one finger, briefly, to his own lips. Bray's mouth opened, closed, and opened again, and whatever he had been about to say died somewhere behind his teeth as he took the full measure of that small, silent gesture, a duke asking, without a word spoken aloud in his own church, for one more day of a lie he had already half forgiven for the girl's sake. The old man was no fool. He understood, watching the two of them, exactly what he was being asked to carry, and exactly what it would cost him in his own conscience to carry it. "I am quite recovered," he said at last, rising unsteadily from the stool, his voice not entirely level. "The damp, I expect. My knees are not what they were." He closed the register with great care, as a man closes something he has just understood to be worth a great deal more than its binding suggested. "Mrs. Renshaw, might I trouble you and your daughter for a moment in the vestry, while these good gentlemen see to the small matter of witnessing fees? I find I have a blessing I neglected to give, and I should not like to send a bride out into weather like this without one." It was neatly done, and bought exactly the 2 minutes the Duke needed. He drew Hob aside by the church door while Bray herded the women into the vestry and spoke low and fast. "He knows." Hob's face, already schooled to a foreman's blankness through 4 days of strange instructions, went a shade paler still. "Bray, how?" "The register. I would not sign a false name into a parish book, Hob, whatever else I have let stand unspoken." He read it before I could stop him. He glanced toward the vestry door, where he could hear Mrs. Renshaw's voice rising and falling in some fond, weeping speech to her daughter, and Sibylla's low, patient answers beneath it. "He will hold his tongue a while yet, I think. He is a decent man and fond of the girl, and he has more sense than to ruin a wedding he has just performed. But it buys me days, not weeks. I must tell her myself, and soon, before some careless word from Bray or a look he cannot govern does it for me." "You should have told her before the vows," Hob said, not unkindly, which made it worse. "A man does not build a house on ground he knows is going to shift." "I know it," the Duke said, and found, saying it aloud, that he meant it more than he had let himself feel in 4 days of licenses and rings and careful half-truths. "I will set it right, only not today. Today she has buried a threat and married a stranger and stood dry-eyed through the whole of it. She has earned one day, Hob, before I hand her another shock to carry." Sibylla emerged from the vestry, a few minutes later with her mother's arm still wrapped tightly round her own. Both women's eyes, red though Mrs. Renshaw's tears, at least, had plainly turned to something gladder by the end of whatever had passed between them. And Rector Bray following behind, with the particular careful composure of a man determined not to let his face say what his mind was still reeling to absorb. "Well," Sibylla said, coming to stand before her new husband in the church porch, rain still falling steady beyond the door, her chin lifted in that same defiant angle she had worn since the churchyard. "It is done. I am married. Mr. Vale has seen it with his own eyes standing in this very doorway not half an hour since, and my mother is safe from him whatever else the day brings. I confess I had not thought, this time last week, that I should ever be glad of a wet Tuesday." "Nor I," the Duke said, and found the words truer than he had expected them to be when he opened his mouth to say them. Behind her, Rector Bray caught his eye once more over the top of her bent head, a long look, unreadable, that promised nothing beyond the silence already given, and then turned away to see to his register, leaving the bride and her stranger husband standing together in the porch, married, and still, in every way that would soon come to matter, unknown to one another. Nobody else read the register. That was the strange mercy of it, the Duke thought, standing in the small hired parlor above the Draycott Renshaw Inn where he had arranged, for want of anywhere better, that the wedding party should take a cold collation before the day scattered them each to their own concerns. Bray had said nothing further. Hob had said nothing at all, which from Hob was its own kind of statement. Mrs. Renshaw, weeping gently over cold ham and thinking of nothing beyond her daughter's safety, had not so much as glanced at the book her daughter signed. And Sibylla herself, sharp-eyed, careful, suspicious of every unexplained thing about the man she had married, had been too occupied with her mother, with the relief crashing over her in waves now the danger was past, with the sheer strangeness of being a wife, to think of asking to see what her own husband had written beneath her name. She thought, watching him across the small parlor as the sexton's wife poured out weak tea for everyone in turn, that she had married a poor man who mended church roofs and knew a bishop's secretary through some old kindness done, and nothing in his bearing that afternoon troubled the thought. He stood a little apart, as men of small means often did in a room where the talk ran to gowns and settlements, and answered Mrs. Renshaw's timid, grateful questions about his prospects with such careful vagueness that she took it, kindly, for a poor man's modesty rather than what it actually was. "You will forgive me," Mrs. Renshaw said to him, dabbing her eyes, "for not asking more before now. I ought to have asked a great deal more before now. But Sibylla is a sensible girl, and I trusted her judgment above my own frightened one, and I find, sir, now that it is done, that I am only grateful. Whatever your situation, you have saved my daughter from a fate I could not save her from myself, and I shall not forget it as long as I live." "You owe me no thanks, Mrs. Renshaw," he said, which was true in a way she could not have understood, since the greater debt, in his own accounting, ran the opposite direction entirely. Sibylla came to stand beside him a little later, when her mother had been persuaded to sit and rest, and studied him with the frank, assessing look of a woman taking inventory of a purchase already made and past returning. "I do not even know," she said low, so the room would not hear, "where we are to live, sir. I have married you, and I do not know your situation beyond a coat and a mallet and a friend in a bishop's household. Am I to keep house for you in lodgings? Is there a cottage? I ask only so that I may begin arranging my mind to it, not to reproach you. I chose this with my eyes open, and I do not mean to begin the marriage by complaining of the very bargain I struck." "There is a house," he said carefully. It wants a great deal of work. It is not, he searched for the honest word that was still, technically, not a lie. It is not comfortable, at present, in the way a lady is generally accustomed to comfort. There is more roof than is finished and more debt on the land than I would wish on any wife. I will not pretend to you it is an easy thing I bring you to. She absorbed this the way she seemed to absorb everything, quickly and without self-pity, already turning it over for its practical edges. Then, I shall be useful rather than comfortable, which suits me better regardless. I have kept a small household on very little money for 5 years since my father died, sir. I can turn a hem, salt a ham, doctor a fever, and keep accounts that balance to the farthing. If there is a leaking roof, I have at least married a man who knows which end of a ladder to hold. A ghost of her old dry humor surfaced, brief and real, the first he had seen since the churchyard. I did not marry you for comfort. I do not intend to be disappointed simply because I have received exactly what I understood I was purchasing. He looked at her steady, unbowed, already rolling up her sleeves in her mind for a life she believed would be plain and hard, and was going to discover, far sooner than he was ready for her to discover it, was neither of those things, and felt the lie sit in his chest like a stone he had swallowed, and could not now safely bring back up in company. "We cannot stay in this parish," he said instead, because it was the truer and more urgent thing. "Vale has been humiliated today, watching from a church porch, and a humiliated man with means to make trouble does not sit quiet for long. He may not be able to touch the marriage itself, but he can make your mother's life difficult in 100 small ways short of the law, and he can make yours difficult by staying, and talking, and being seen to have lost. I think it best we leave within the day." Leave? Sybilla's composure flickered for the first time since the register. Leave for where? "North," he said. "My home is 3 counties north of here. A long way, 4 days hard traveling, and not an easy road in this weather. But it is a long way also from Mr. Pentland Vale, and I think that, just at present, is worth more to both of us than comfort on the journey." 4 days. She looked past him, out the small parlor window at her mother's small, familiar world, the church tower, the mill, the lane where she had shouted up at a stranger on a ladder not 5 days before, and something crossed her face that was not quite regret and not quite fear, but stood close kin to both. "I had not thought, marrying in such haste, that I should be leaving so entirely and so soon. I had thought foolishly, I see now, that I might stay near enough to watch over my mother, at least at first." "Your mother will be watched over," he said, with a certainty that surprised even him in the saying of it, though he could not yet tell her why he was so sure of it, or what quiet arrangement he intended to make to guarantee the promise before he ever left the parish. "I give you my word on that, whatever else you doubt of me." She studied his face a long moment, weighing the word against 4 days' acquaintance and a churchyard proposal, and something in her, perhaps only exhaustion, perhaps something she was not yet ready to name, decided, visibly, to trust it. "Then I had best say my goodbyes properly," she said, "since it seems I am to be a northern wife by Friday, married to a man I have known less than a week, going to a house I have never seen, for reasons I am only beginning to understand, were never quite as simple as a ladder and a license." The rest of that long afternoon passed in the particular, hurried grief of a leave-taking. No one had time to properly grieve. Sybylla packed what little she owned into a single trunk that had been her father's 2 gowns, a mended cloak, a small wooden box of letters she would not let the porter carry for her, insisting on holding it in her own lap in the gig rather than trust it to the baggage, while her mother moved about the small bedroom folding and refolding things that did not need folding, unable to keep her hands still and unwilling to say so. "You will write," Mrs. Renshaw said, for perhaps the 6th time, standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped round herself against a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "Every week, Mama. More often if the roads allow the post to run. And if he is unkind to you, if the house is worse than he says, or the people cold to a stranger's wife, you will tell me. You will not bear it silently the way you bear everything, Sibylla, out of some notion that complaining is a weakness. I would rather know." "I'm not marrying a cruel man," Sibylla said, with more certainty than she had any real evidence yet to support, and glanced, saying it, toward the window where she could see her husband below in the inn-yard, deep in low conversation with Hob Silito over the hire of a second gig for the baggage. "I do not know him well, Mamma. I will grant you that freely. But I have watched him 4 days now, and whatever else is uncertain about the shape of this marriage, I do not believe cruelty is in it." It was, though she could not have known it, the truest thing either of them said that whole long afternoon, and it would return to her more than once in the harder months ahead, a small anchor thrown down early that held when a great deal else came loose. Below in the inn-yard, the Duke settled the matter of the second gig with more coin than the transaction strictly warranted, because haste cost money, and he had decided, watching Vale's dark shape retreat from the church porch that morning, that haste was worth buying at any price the road offered. Hob watched him count out the notes with the particular narrow-eyed patience of a man who had served the family long enough to say what he thought without much ceremony about it. "You mean to tell her on the road," Hob said. "It was not a question." "I mean to tell her when the telling will not read as a threat, or a bribe, or a man softening a blow he already knows is coming. On the road, with 4 days and no audience and no Vale within 100 miles to make it look like fear driving the confession, yes. That is when I mean to tell her. And if she asks outright before then, she is not a stupid woman, your grace. She will see the horses, the money, the way men speak to you when they think themselves unobserved. 4 days is a long road for a clever woman to travel blind." The Duke said nothing to that, because he had no good answer to give, only the growing, uncomfortable certainty that Hob was right, and that the 4 days he had chosen as the safest possible moment for honesty might, in the event, prove to be nothing more than 4 days of borrowed time before the truth found its own way out regardless of his plans for it. By the time the 2 gigs stood loaded in the inn-yard, dusk was coming down gray and early over the wet street, and Sibylla came out to meet him with her mother's arms still warm on her shoulders and her eyes red, but dry, climbing up beside him without waiting to be handed, as though she meant to prove, by the plain fact of not hesitating, that she had chosen this and would not now flinch from the choosing. She did not see, settling her father's trunk against her knees, the glance the Duke exchanged with Hob over the horses' backs. A glance that said, more plainly than either man would have spoken aloud, that 4 days was not nearly so much time as it had sounded, back in the safety of a wet churchyard, before either of them had truly reckoned what the telling was going to cost. The first day on the road was mostly silence, the particular exhausted silence of 2 people who had each spent a week surviving something, and had not yet found the words to speak of it to a stranger they had promised to spend a lifetime beside. Sibylla slept for 2 hours against the swaying corner of the gig, her father's letter-box gripped in her lap even in sleep, and woke with a start somewhere past noon, apologizing for the lapse as though rest itself were a debt she had no right to incur. "You need not apologize for sleeping," the Duke said. "You have had a hard week." "I have had a hard week and married a stranger at the end of it, and I find myself waking every hour half certain I have dreamed the whole business, and that I shall open my eyes properly, and find myself back in my mother's kitchen with the wedding still 11 days off and undecided." She rubbed her eyes, self-conscious, and glanced sideways at him, as if to reassure herself he was, in fact, real. You are very patient with a wife who keeps forgetting she is one. We are neither of us much practiced at it yet, he said. I do not think there is a wrong way to be new at something this strange. It was, he reflected privately, watching the hedgerows slide past, a truer sentence than she could know, since he was no more practiced at honesty in this particular marriage than she was at trusting a husband she had known 5 days, and the thought did not sit easily with him for the rest of that first silent afternoon. By the second day on the road, the Duke of Ilverdon had learned that his wife could darn a stocking, recite the whole of the Book of Ruth from memory, and go 4 hours without complaint on a jolting gig seat that would have had most ladies of his acquaintance calling for salts within the first mile. She had also, by the second day, begun planning. A school, she said, over a cold supper at a coaching inn somewhere past the county line, the fire smoking badly and the landlord's wife eyeing her plain traveling dress with the particular assessing look innkeepers reserved for guests. They had not yet decided how much to charge. If the house wants so much repair, there will be little enough spent on schooling for the tenants' children, I should think, and I have a fair hand and patience enough for letters and figures both. I could keep a school 2 afternoons a week, in whatever room can be spared, and charge nothing, and it would cost you only candles and slates. You have given this some thought, he said, watching her over the rim of his cup, half a smile he did not let reach his mouth. I have given it a great deal of thought. I have also thought I might take in sewing, if the local seamstress will teach me the finer stitches. I am competent but not accomplished, and accomplished work pays better. And I thought, if there is a kitchen garden gone to ruin, which in a half-finished house there generally is, that I might put it right myself rather than pay a man to do it badly. I do not intend to be an ornament in a house I cannot yet see, sir. I intend to be of use. He should have told her then. The words rose in him again, as they had a dozen times already on the road, that there was no need of sewing money, no want of candles, that the house she was imagining as a poor man's ruin was in fact a duke's half-mended seat with land enough under it to swallow her small economies 100 times over and never notice the loss. But watching her across the smoking fire, sketching out a life of useful poverty with such fierce, unguarded hope in her face, he found he could not make himself say it. And the reason, when he examined it honestly that night lying awake in a narrow inn bed while she slept in the room beyond, unsettled him more than the lie itself. No one had ever planned to be useful to him before. Women of his own rank planned to be admired by him, or married advantageously through him, or occasionally, in the case of the bolder widows who called at Ilverdon House in London, seduced by him for the settling of their own debts. No one had ever sat across a smoking fire and planned, with real joy in the planning, how she might make herself indispensable to a poor man's household purely because the household needed her, and she had decided, of her own free will, to be needed. He had never, he realized somewhere past midnight, listening to the inn's timbers settle around him, been liked for nothing before. Every kindness done him in 3 decades had come attached to his title the way a shadow comes attached to a body inseparable, impossible to court one without the other following. Sibylla Renshaw had married a coat and a mallet and a set of careful vague promises, had planned a life of school-keeping and mended stockings around a man she believed owned nothing grander than a wrecked cottage, and every soft look she had begun, almost against her own guarded will, to give him across the supper table was a look given to that man, and not to the Duke hiding inside his clothes. It was, he thought, the single most honest thing that had ever been offered him, and he was building it, brick by careful brick, on a foundation of silence that could not hold forever. The third day brought worse roads and better weather. the country climbing steadily now into hills stitched with dry stone walls and gray with distant rain. And Sibylla, who had spent the first 2 days composing herself with great effort into the shape of a woman prepared for hardship, began on the third day to relax into something closer to her natural temper, quick, curious, unexpectedly funny, pointing out absurdities along the road with a dry commentary that had him laughing aloud twice before noon. A sound he did not think he had made freely in longer than he cared to count. "You do not talk like a man who spends his days on ladders," she observed, somewhere on the afternoon of the third day, watching him with narrowed, thoughtful eyes as the gig climbed a long grade between two hills. "You quote Latin without meaning to. You corrected the innkeeper's Greek motto over his own door last night, and he did not even take offense, which tells me you did it kindly, which is its own kind of strange in a laboring man. Where did a mender of roofs learn Latin, sir?" "An old tutor," he said, which was true, who believed a man's hands and his mind need not be strangers to one another. Also true, and also, he was aware, a door left deliberately ajar rather than opened. She studied him a moment longer, and he watched her decide, again, not to press. Though this time the decision cost her visibly more effort than it had in the churchyard, her curiosity plainly sharpening with every mile that carried them further from anyone who might answer her questions for him. "You are a puzzle, mister," she stopped, colored faintly. "I do not even call you by a Christian name yet, do you realize? 4 days married, and I have been calling you, sir, as though you were still a stranger on a ladder." "You may call me Cuthbert," he said. "It is my name. Whatever else about me remains unexplained to your satisfaction." "Cuthbert," she repeated, testing the shape of it, and something in her face softened at the sound of it in her own mouth, a small, unguarded warmth she did not seem aware she was showing him. "It suits you better than sir did. Less like a debt being collected and more like a man." He said nothing to that, only watched the road climb, and thought, with a discomfort that had begun to feel less like guilt and more like dread, of how much further there was still to climb before the valley opened, and the truth could no longer be postponed. That evening, at the last inn before the final pass, she asked him to teach her a few words of the Latin she had caught him murmuring under his breath at a milestone, and he found himself, for an hour by candlelight, doing exactly that, patient, unhurried, more at ease than he could remember being with anyone in years, while she repeated declensions back to him with theatrical seriousness, and laughed at her own mistakes, until the innkeeper's wife put her head round the door to ask if all was well. It was, he thought afterward, lying awake and listening to her breathing settle in the next room, the closest either of them had yet come to an evening that was simply happy, uncomplicated by debts or disguises, and he resented, with real and surprising force, that he could not seem to let it stay that way. On the fourth morning they came up over the last long pass in thin, cold sunlight, the gigs laboring, the horses blowing hard in the sharp air, and Sibylla, who had talked almost without pause since breakfast, giddy with nearness to journey's end, fell suddenly and completely silent as the road crested the ridge, and the whole of the valley opened out below them for the first time. He had written, that third night, a short letter by candlelight while she slept in the room beyond, not to her, but to his own steward at Ilverdon, instructing that a quiet allowance be settled on a Mrs. Renshaw of Draycott Renshaw parish, arranged through a lawyer and never traced to his own name, so that whatever harm Vale still meant to work would find a woman better armored against it than she yet knew to be. He had sealed it and given it to Hob to carry ahead by the fastest horse, and had told Sibylla nothing of it, telling himself it was a small kindness that did not yet require confession. One more brick laid on a foundation already grown too tall for comfort. She did not speak for a long moment. Then she turned to him, her face caught between wonder and the first cold thread of suspicion, and said, very quietly, "Cuthbert, whose house is that?" "That," the Duke said, and found the single syllable harder to produce than any speech he had given in a decade of running an estate, "is Ilverdon, my house." For a long moment Sibylla said nothing at all. The valley spread below them in the thin morning light, a great gray house with half its east wing scaffolded and roofless, slate stacked in the forecourt like a quarry come loose, but a house nonetheless, vast even in its ruin, with parkland rolling away from it in every direction, and a river cutting silver through fields dotted, as far as the eye could carry, with sheep beyond any counting a poor man's flock would run to. "Your house," she repeated, very carefully, as though testing whether the words might rearrange themselves into something less impossible if she said them slowly enough. "The mender of church roofs, the friend of a bishop's secretary, that is your house." "Yes." "And the man who owns that house who owns, I should think, most of what I can see from this ridge is called what, precisely? Because I do not believe I am married to a Mr. Cuthbert of no particular surname, whatever a country register might have led an old rector to nearly faint over." He made himself hold her gaze, though every instinct built over 34 years of guardedness told him to look away. "Cuthbert Ansley Ray, Duke of Ilverdon," he said. "That is the whole of it. That is who signed your register, Sibylla, while you were looking at your mother instead of the page." The silence that followed was worse than any shouting could have been. She sat very still in the gig, hands folded white-knuckled in her lap, and when she finally spoke her voice was low and level in a way that frightened him more than fury would have. "A duke," she said. "I married a duke in a wet churchyard, believing I was saving myself from one predator by binding myself to a poor stranger with nothing to gain from the bargain but a wife who could darn stockings. And the whole time, the whole 4 days I sat across from you planning a school with candle stubs and mended slates, telling you my small, careful economies, as though they mattered to a man who owns a river, you let me believe it. You watched me plan a life of usefulness to spare your feelings the burden of my gratitude, and said nothing." He thought, for one wild moment, of every argument he might have made that a duke traveling under a laborer's name was not so very rare a thing, that half the great houses of England had some story of a lord gone incognito for sport or safety, that Sibylla herself had wanted, above every other quality, a husband whose word could be trusted rather than a title she could be dazzled by. None of it, he understood even as it rose in him, would serve. Every excuse was only the lie wearing a fresh coat. "I did not set out to deceive you for sport," he said. "I meant to tell you before the wedding. Then there was no time before the wedding, with veil closing in, and I meant to tell you after, when the danger had passed, and you could not mistake the truth for a threat holding a debt over your head instead of a duke's ring on your finger. You had 4 days on a road, sir, with nothing but time." Her voice cracked at last, not into tears but into something harder, colder. 4 days and 100 openings and Latin lessons by candlelight, and you chose every single one of them to say nothing rather than the truth. Do you know what that is called, when a person withholds the truth precisely because the truth would change how they are treated? "I know what it is called." "Then say it." "A lie," he said quietly. "It is called a lie, whatever kinder name I have been giving it in my own head for 4 days. That, at least, seemed to cost her some of her fury, hearing him name it plainly rather than defend it, though the hurt beneath the anger did not lessen for the honesty. She looked away from him, down at the great half-ruined house in the valley, and when she spoke again her voice had gone quiet and tired in a way that troubled him more than her anger had. "I do not know what I am angry about more," she said, "that you are a duke or that I like the poor man better. I had begun, God help me, 4 days married, and I had begun to think I had been fortunate, that whatever the marriage lacked in choosing, it had gained in the choosing of him. And now I find the man I was beginning to like does not exist. He was a coat, and a mallet, and a very well-managed silence, worn by a stranger with a title I never consented to marry. "I am the same man," he said, and heard, even as he said it, how thin the defense sounded against what she had just laid before him. "The coat did not make me kind, Sibylla, nor did the title make me cruel. I am exactly the man who climbed down the ladder. I have only failed, for 4 days running, to tell you the whole truth of what climbing down cost me nothing to do." "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps a man who can wear a lie so easily, for so long, without it troubling his sleep, is not quite the man I thought I had married either way." She drew her cloak tighter, though the morning was not especially cold, and did not look at him again as the gigs began their long descent into the valley. "Take me down to your house, your grace. I find I have a great deal to say to you still, but I find also that I should rather say it somewhere. I am not obliged to shout it down a hillside for the benefit of your foreman." The descent took the better part of an hour, switchbacking down through dry stone-walled fields, where laborers straightened from their work to stare openly at the gigs, and word of the Duke's return plainly outran the horses, because by the time they clattered into the great scarred forecourt, a small crowd of estate servants and workmen had gathered, uncertain and curious, murmuring at the sight of a strange young woman beside their master. A stout, gray-haired woman in a housekeeper's black came forward first, wiping her hands on her apron in evident astonishment, and dropped a curtsy so hasty it nearly unbalanced her. "Your Grace," we had no word, no letter ahead. I've nothing prepared for it. Her eyes went to Sibylla, widened further, and she curtsied again, deeper this time, plainly working out the arithmetic of a strange young woman arriving at the Duke's side in a hired gig with a battered trunk and no maid. "Mrs. Alcombe, madam, housekeeper here this 11 years. If her Grace will forgive the state of the house, we had no notice at all." "Her Grace," Sibylla repeated under her breath, testing the title the way a person tests ice before trusting their full weight to it, and something in her composure faltered for the first time since the ridge, not into tears, but into a kind of stunned, private reckoning, as though the housekeeper's plain courtesy had made the whole enormous fact of what she had married real to her in a way even the house itself had not quite managed. Hobsilito swung down from the second gig, and busied himself with the baggage rather than meet anyone's eye, and the Duke was grateful, at least, that his foreman had the sense not to offer commentary in front of the assembled household on how the last 4 days had actually been spent. She stepped down from the gig without his hand to help her, refusing it with a small, deliberate turn of her shoulder that stung more than any words could have, and stood looking up at the vast half-finished house, the scaffolding, the missing slates, the great patched wound of the east wing where fire or neglect or simple poverty had eaten a house alive over years. And something in her face shifted, the anger not gone but joined now by a different, more clear-eyed calculation. "You told me the house wanted work," she said slowly, taking it all in. "You did not lie about that, at least." "No, that part was entirely true." "How much debt," she said, turning to him at last, and her voice had steadied into something businesslike, almost dangerous in its calm, "sits on this estate, your Grace?" "Not the roof, the whole of it. I find I should like the true figure, since I have already been given every false comfort a man can offer a woman he does not trust with his real burdens." He told her. The number, spoken aloud in the cold forecourt with his own tenants watching, was worse than any figure he had ever admitted to another living soul, and he watched it land on her, watched her absorb it the way she seemed to absorb everything, quickly, without flinching, filing it away for use rather than despair. "Then you had better show me the accounts," Sibylla Renshaw Duchess of Ilverdon said. "Before supper, if you please. I find I am no longer interested in being managed. I should like to be useful, sir, and I find you have finally, if entirely by accident, brought me somewhere I actually can be." He led her through the great hall himself, past dust sheets and a staircase missing half its balusters, aware with every step of Mrs. Alcombe trailing behind them in a state of barely suppressed alarm at the disorder her new mistress was being made to see on her very first hour in the house, and aware too of Sybilla's eyes moving over all of it, not with the horror he had braced for, but with the same quick, cataloging attention she had once turned on a leaking church roof, already, even furious, beginning without quite meaning to the work of taking the measure of what needed doing. "The estate office," he said, stopping before a heavy door at the end of the corridor, "is through here. The books have not been properly kept since my father's man died 2 winters past. I warn you, they are not pleasant reading." "Little about this week has been pleasant reading, your grace," she said, and pushed past him through the door without waiting to be shown in. "So I do not imagine a ledger will trouble me overmuch by comparison." By the first hard frost, the Duke of Ilverdon had learned to dread breakfast. In the particular way a man dreads the 1 hour of his day, guaranteed to prove him wrong about something before the porridge had gone cold. "The Michaelmas rents from the low pastures are wrong," Sybylla said, not looking up from the ledger propped against the teapot, a habit Mrs. Alcombe had given up scolding her for within the first fortnight. "Holly's has been charged for 11 acres of grazing, and I walked the boundary myself yesterday with Hob. It is 9, at the very most, and has been 9 since before your father's time, if the old field book in the estate office is to be trusted over whatever your last steward was doing with his sums. Holly's has held 11 acres by custom for 30 years, the Duke said, though without much conviction, because he had learned by now that when his wife said she had walked a boundary herself, she generally had, in whatever weather the walking required, in boots that were not, strictly, fit for a duchess. Custom is not acreage, Cuthbert. Custom is simply a mistake nobody has yet troubled to correct, because correcting it is uncomfortable. I do not say Holly's is a thief. I say he has been paying, honestly and in good faith, for 2 acres of grass that were never truly his to pay for, and either the boundary is wrong or the rent roll is, and one of the two of us ought to find out which before Michaelmas comes round again." It had become, over the 4 months since their arrival, the shape of their mornings. She with the household and the estate books, laid open now with a thoroughness his father's steward had never approached. He with the roof, the tenants, the endless slow grinding work of a great house dragged back from the edge of ruin one repaired beam at a time. She had turned out, to his continual, humbled astonishment, to be very good at all of it, sharper with figures than he was himself, patient with tenants in a way his own guardedness had never quite managed, and entirely unafraid to tell him, over cooling tea, precisely where he had been wrong. There had been a night in October he thought of often, though he had not spoken of it to her since. She had come upon him in the estate office past midnight, unable to sleep for worry over a tenant's sick child, and found him still awake over the accounts himself, and for an hour they had sat together by a single guttering candle saying very little, only passing a ledger back and forth, and once, reaching for the same column of figures at the same moment, letting their hands rest together on the page a moment longer than the reaching required before either of them drew back. Neither had remarked on it. But he had thought of that small, wordless hour more than he liked to admit in the weeks since, turning it over the way a man turns over a coin he is not yet ready to spend. The school had happened, exactly as she had promised it would on a cold night 4 months and a lifetime ago. She had begun with 6 children in the disused laundry, teaching letters and figures 2 afternoons a week, with slates bought from her own small allowance, before he had discovered what she was spending it on, and quietly doubled it without telling her why. By the first frost the laundry held 11 children, and Sibylla had taken to arriving at supper with chalk dust on her sleeve, and a fierce, unguarded pride in her face that he found, more often than he cared to admit even to himself. He had begun arranging his own day around the pleasure of seeing. He had gone once, unannounced, to stand at the laundry door and watch her teach, and had not let her know he had come. Had simply stood in the cold passage a quarter hour, watching her crouch beside a small shepherd's boy too shy to sound out his own name aloud. Patient and warm in a way she had never once been patient or warm with him in an argument over rents, and had come away from the doorway with something tight and unfamiliar lodged behind his ribs that he did not, at the time, have a name for. He had it now. He had simply not yet found the courage to say the word aloud, to her or to himself, in anything but the safety of his own private thought. He had not expected to be argued with quite so thoroughly, quite so often, or to enjoy it as much as he did. "You are wrong about the sheep," she told him one November evening, over a meal that had gone cold twice already for the length of the conversation. "You mean to sell the whole of the autumn wool clip to Marchant in the market town, because your father always sold to Marchant, and Marchant, having no competition for your custom, pays you 2 shillings under the fair price and has done for years. I have written to a wool factor in Leeds. He offers 4 shillings more the stone, and asks only that you commit the clip a season ahead, which you can well afford to do. I have sold to Marchant for 15 years. Then it is past time you stopped," she said, entirely unrepentant, "and I do not see why loyalty to a man's habit of cheating you should count for more than loyalty to the 600 people this estate is meant to support. You did not marry a decorative wife, your grace. You married a woman who can read a contract, and I have read Marchant's, and it is a disgrace." He had laughed, really laughed, the sound surprising him as much as it plainly surprised Mrs. Alcombe, passing the doorway with a tray, and said, "Write to your factor in Leeds, then, and God help Marchant when he learns who has been reading his contracts." There had been other small victories that autumn too, easier to laugh over than the wool clip. She had insisted, over Mrs. Alcombe's horrified objections, on repapering the small breakfast parlor herself with a length of yellow-sprigged paper found forgotten in an attic trunk, declaring the house had quite enough gray stone in it without gray walls as well, and the Duke had come down one morning to find her balanced on a chair with paste on her nose, laughing too hard at her own crooked seam to finish the job properly, and had ended, coat discarded, holding the ladder steady for an hour while she directed him with a general's authority and no gratitude whatsoever for the service. It was, in its own small way, the first room in the house that had ever felt entirely like a place 2 people meant to live rather than merely to endure. It was not, he understood even as he said it, the marriage either of them had bargained for in a wet churchyard. She had not fully forgiven him the deception. There remained, still, a careful distance in her that 4 months of shared work had softened without yet dissolving, a wariness that surfaced most often in the quiet hours after the household slept, when he sometimes found her at the estate office window long after she ought to have retired, watching the dark hills as though still, after everything, taking their measure. But something had grown in the space between the anger and the forgiveness that neither of them had named aloud. A companionship built out of ledgers and cold mutton and 11 children learning their letters, that felt, on his better days, more solid than anything a grander courtship could have offered. He watched her now, across the cooling supper, laughing at some remark of her own making, chalk dust still faintly visible at her wrist, and thought, with the particular ache of a man recognizing something too late to properly guard it, that he had married a stranger to save her from ruin and found, somewhere on the road north, that he could no longer imagine the house, or himself, without her in it. He had begun, in the privacy of his own mind, to think of telling her so plainly, not the truth about the debt, not yet, but the plainer truth underneath it, that whatever had begun as a kindness on a ladder had become, without his quite marking the moment it happened, the center around which the whole rest of his life now arranged itself. The letter came 3 days later, carried up from the receiving room by a footman with the particular careful blankness servants wore when they suspected bad news, and did not wish to be blamed for delivering it. Sibylla broke the seal at the breakfast table, her mother's hand instantly recognizable even before she had unfolded the single close-written page, and the Duke watched the color leave her face by degrees as she read first pale, then paler, her fingers tightening on the paper until it creased beneath them. "Sibylla." She did not answer at once. When she looked up, her eyes were bright and hard. The fear he had first seen in a churchyard 4 months gone now returned in full and sharpened by everything the intervening months had taught her about how much worse a determined enemy could make things. "My mother writes," she said, "that Mr. Pentland Vale has called in every note she holds with him, all at once with no warning and no mercy, and that he is telling the whole parish openly at the inn, to anyone who will listen, that my marriage to you was got by fraud, that I was coerced, or the license irregular, or worse. She says he means to see it unmade in the courts if he can manage it, whatever the cost, purely so that he need not be seen to have lost." She set the letter down with hands that were no longer entirely steady. "He is not merely angry any longer, Cuthbert. He is ruining her to spite me, and he means, I think, to try to take everything from us both." He took the letter from her hands and read it through twice himself, standing at the head of the breakfast table with the cold tea forgotten between them, and felt a familiar, dangerous stillness settle over him. The same cold clarity that had once made 600 tenants trust him with their winter stores and their disputes and their small, desperate hopes, because a man who goes quiet before trouble rather than loud is a man worth trusting to end it properly. Mrs. Renshaw's hand, usually neat and careful, had grown ragged toward the letter's close, the ink blotted where a tear or a trembling wrist had struck the page. Vale had not merely called in the notes, it seemed, but had gone about the parish in person, calling on the rector, the magistrate's clerk, anyone with standing enough to matter, planting doubt like a man salting a field he meant never to let grow again. It was not the act of a creditor seeking his due. It was the act of a man who had been humiliated once, in a rain-soaked church porch, and had waited 4 months for the precise moment to make someone pay for it. "I am going south," the Duke said, before she had finished refolding the letter, "and I am going alone. Today, if the horses can be readied in time." Sibylla's head came up sharply. "Alone?" "Vale has moved against your mother directly, and he is spreading a claim that could unmake this marriage in law if it is left unanswered long enough to take root in the right ears. That is not a fight I mean to bring you into. I have solicitors in the market town who can be at your mother's door within 2 days if I ride hard enough to set them moving myself, and a word to say to Vale that will land a great deal harder from a duke standing in his own parlor than from any letter." "It is my mother," she said, "and my marriage he is attacking. I do not see how either of those becomes less mine to answer simply because you have found a way to make it yours instead." "It becomes mine," he said, more sharply than he meant to, "because I am the one with the standing to end it cleanly, and because I will not have you within 100 miles of a man who has already shown he will use anyone within his reach to wound you. You are safer here. The children need their lessons continued. The wool contract wants finishing with the factor, and I would rather leave the house in hands I trust than drag you into a fight that may turn uglier before it turns clean. It was, he would understand only much later, precisely the wrong thing to say to a woman who had spent 5 years managing a household alone, and 4 months since proving, ledger by ledger, that she required no man's protection to be equal to a crisis. And he watched the words land on her exactly as badly as they deserved to. "You are protecting me," Sibylla said, very quietly, "the same way you protected me from the truth of who you were for 4 days on a road, by deciding, on my behalf, what I am strong enough to bear, and telling me only after the deciding is done. That is not fair. Is it not? You went to a bishop's secretary without asking me. You wrote to your steward about my mother's allowance without telling me. And yes, Cuthbert, I found the letter copy in your desk drawer in November, and said nothing because I did not know how to thank a man for a kindness he had gone to such trouble to hide from me. You have spent this entire marriage managing me quietly for my own good, and I have let it pass because the causes were kind ones. This is not a kind one. This is my mother and my name, and I will not sit in a school laundry teaching sums while you ride south to fight my battle for me and call it protection." He stopped, struck silent for a moment by the fact of the allowance discovered, and never mentioned, by the whole quiet architecture of care she had apparently been watching him build around her for months, without a single word of acknowledgment or complaint, and felt something in his chest twist at the thought of how much of her own hurt she had simply absorbed rather than spend on him, while he rode off now to spend himself on a battle he had, once again, decided alone was his to fight. "I am not trying to erase you from it," he said, more gently. "I am trying to keep you from a man who has already proven he does not fight fair, and who would delight in nothing more than seeing you stand in his parlor while he humiliates you in front of witnesses. Let me go first. Let me draw his fire onto ground I can control. I will send for you the moment it is safe. And if it is never entirely safe, men like Vale do not fight fair because fighting fair loses them nothing they value losing. You cannot promise me safety, Cuthbert, only caution, and I have had a bellyful of being managed for caution's sake by men who loved me, and thought that love entitled them to decide things for me." Her eyes, bright and hard, held his without flinching. "My father did it. He left my mother ignorant of half his affairs, because he thought ignorance would spare her worry. And when he died, she understood nothing of the debts he had left and walked straight into Vale's hands for want of a single honest conversation years before it mattered. I will not watch you make the same mistake with me, because you have convinced yourself it is kindness." The comparison struck harder than any accusation of deceit had, precisely because he could see, laid bare in it, the shape of every choice he had made since the churchyard, the license bought in secret, the allowance sent unspoken, the surname withheld on the road, and now this, one more decision made for her rather than with her, dressed up as love and functioning in practice, exactly like the thing she had just named. "You are right," he said slowly. "I have been doing precisely that since the day I climbed down the ladder, and I told myself each time it was kindness, because the alternative was admitting I did not trust you to bear the truth alongside me. That was never fair to you. It was never even, in the end, about protecting you. It was about protecting myself from watching you decide, with full knowledge of everything I am, that you did not want me after all." Sibylla went very still at that, something in her face softening for the first time since the letter had arrived, though she did not yet let go of the argument entirely. "That is the most honest thing you have said to me in 4 months, Your Grace." "Then let me say one more honest thing. I am afraid of what Vale intends to do to your mother, and I am afraid of what standing in his parlor will require of me, and I would still rather ride south alone tonight and take that fear onto my own shoulders than watch it land on yours. Not because I think you weak. Because I have finally understood, standing here arguing with you, that I cannot lose you, Sibylla, and a man who has finally understood that is not always a reasonable man about how he goes about keeping it from happening. It was as near to a declaration as either of them had yet come, wrung out of him by argument rather than romance, and she heard the whole shape of it, the fear underneath the stubbornness, the love underneath the fear, even as she shook her head, unwilling, even moved, to yield the larger point. I understand the fear, she said. I do not forgive the deciding not this time. Ride south tonight if you must, Cuthbert. But I will not sit in this house waiting on a letter to tell me whether my mother is ruined and my marriage unmade. I am your wife, not your ward, and I am coming south whether you send for me or not, a day behind you, if that is what it takes, but coming. He looked at her a long moment, weighing the argument he knew. Even as he opened his mouth to make it, he had already lost. Then come, he said finally. God help either of us if I have learned nothing at all these 4 months, but come honestly, at my side, not a day behind sneaking after me on the mail coach, because I have once again decided your safety without asking you first. She was already moving toward the door to call for her cloak before he had finished the sentence, and he watched her go with a strange, unfamiliar lightness cutting through the dread. The sense, entirely new to him, of riding into danger not alone for the first time in longer than he could remember, but beside someone who had just, in the space of 1 furious quarter-hour, made unmistakably plain exactly how much she had already come to matter. He found Hob in the stable yard within the quarter-hour, already shouting the horses into readiness on nothing more than the sound of raised voices carrying from the breakfast-room, and gave his orders fast and low, 2 mounts saddled for hard riding, a third for Hob himself, letters to be sent ahead to the solicitor in the market town, and quietly, to a second man Hob would know how to find. A man who kept records at the diocesan registry, and owed the Duke a favor considerably larger than Otterburn's. You are bringing her Grace, Hob said, not quite a question, watching Sibylla cross the yard in her traveling cloak with a face set for battle. I am bringing my wife, the Duke said, because I have finally learned, Hob, at no small cost to my own pride, that a man does not keep a woman safe by keeping her ignorant. Whatever waits for us in Vale's parlor, she meets it beside me, or she does not meet it at all. But she will not be told to wait behind a closed door for a letter to explain what has already been decided without her. Hobb's face did something complicated, caught between approval and something that looked almost like relief, as though he had waited 4 months to hear his master say precisely that. About time, your Grace, he said, and went to see to the 3rd horse. They had ridden the last leg into the market town in near silence, 3 days hard on the road behind them, and the Duke had spent every mile of it rehearsing, without success, some way of raising the subject he still meant to keep from her a while longer. The true reason he had come to Draycott Renshaw in the first place, the letter he had carried and never delivered, the debt to a dead man that had brought him south long before a living daughter ever climbed a churchyard wall. He had decided, riding, that he would tell her once Vale was dealt with, in some quiet room of his own choosing, on his own terms. He had not accounted for Vale choosing the terms instead. Mr. Pentland Vale's parlor was a handsome room, over-furnished in a way that spoke of a man who bought comfort rather than inherited it, and the Duke of Ilverdon disliked it on sight, before Vale himself had said a single word. Vale rose from behind his writing table when they were shown in, unhurried, a tall man gone soft at the middle with silvering hair kept fashionably long, and his eyes moved over Sibylla with a slow, proprietary insolence that made the Duke's hand curl at his side before he mastered it. Your Grace, Vale said, with a bow just shallow enough to be its own small insult, and the former Miss Renshaw. I confess I did not expect the pleasure of a personal call. I had thought a duke above troubling himself with a country creditor's quarrel. You made it my quarrel, the duke said, the moment you called Mrs. Renshaw's notes without warning and began telling the parish my marriage was fraudulent. I have come to settle both matters this morning, Mr. Vale, and I do not intend to leave this room until they are settled. Fraudulent is a strong word. I said irregular. Vale spread his hands, all wounded reasonableness. A license bought under a false name, a wedding conducted before witnesses who did not know who they were witnessing. A court might find a great deal to examine there, your grace, whatever the register itself now claims. I am a careful man. I like my dealings on solid ground, and yours, I am told, was built rather quickly in the rain by a man in a laborer's coat. My marriage will withstand any examination a court cares to make of it, the Duke said. The debt is a simpler matter. Name the whole of what Mrs. Renshaw owes you in every particular, and I will discharge it within the hour. Vale's smile thinned, some of the easy confidence going out of it, replaced by a calculation the Duke did not like the shape of. As it happens, your grace, the accounting is not so simple as you suppose. Perhaps your solicitors ought to see the whole ledger of it, every note, every renewal, every instrument that has passed across this desk touching the Renshaw family these 3 years past. I should not like it said afterward that I concealed anything. He crossed to a strong-box set into the wall behind his table, and Sybilla's solicitor, a careful gray man the Duke had brought down from the market town, stepped forward to receive the sheaf of papers Vale drew out and laid, with theatrical care, across the writing table. It was Sybilla who reached them first. She had said very little since entering the room, standing close at the Duke's side with her chin lifted in the same defiant angle she had worn in the churchyard. But now, she moved past him to the table and began turning the papers herself, quick and methodical. The same hands that had untangled a mismeasured boundary, and a cheating wool factor now sorting through the record of her own family's ruin, with a steadiness that made the Duke's chest ache to watch. Vale's man of business, a thin, nervous clerk who had followed the papers into the room and stood now near the door twisting his hands, watched the Duchess turn the pages with the particular dread of a man who suspects, too late, that his employer has handed a weapon to precisely the wrong person to hand it to. Vale himself seemed not to notice, too pleased with his own cleverness in producing the ledger at all, too certain that whatever it contained could only further muddy the question of the marriage's legitimacy, rather than illuminate anything else entirely. She stopped on the 3rd page. The Duke saw her go still before he understood why, saw the color leave her face, saw her hand, holding the paper, begin very faintly to shake. And it was another long moment before he crossed to her side and looked down at what she was looking at, and understood, with a sensation like the floor tilting beneath him, precisely what she had found. It was an instrument of assignment, dated, sealed, entirely legal, a formal notice of intent to purchase the whole of Mrs. Renshaw's outstanding debt from Mr. Pentland Vale, drawn up by a London solicitor, and forwarded to Vale's own man of business under the Duke of Ilverdon's private seal. The date at the top of the page, plain and unmistakable, was a full week before a woman had ever stood shouting from a churchyard wall at a stranger on a ladder. "You were already buying it," Sybilla said. Her voice had gone very quiet and very strange, stripped of the fury it had carried into the room and replaced with something far more dangerous, a bewildered, careful stillness, the sound of a person doing arithmetic they very badly did not want to finish. "A week before I ever climbed that wall and shouted at you, you had already begun buying my mother's debt from him. You did not need to marry me at all. You could have simply bought it. Freed us both, quietly, without ever climbing down a single rung of that ladder." The Duke said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would not make it worse, and his silence was, in its way, the last and most damning confirmation she needed. "Why," she said, and now her voice did break, not into weeping but into something harder and more exposed. "Why did you let me shout my whole desperate bargain at you in the rain? Why did you let me believe I had saved myself, saved my mother, by marrying a stranger, when you already held the means to end it without any of it? Without the license, without the lie of your name, without any of it. You could have handed my mother her freedom and walked away and never once had to marry me at all." "I know," he said quietly. "Then why didn't you?" Her voice cracked wide open on the question, and Vale, watching from behind his writing table with the fascinated attention of a man who has just discovered his enemy's quarrel is more interesting than his own revenge, made no move to intervene, plainly content to let the wound open itself without his assistance. "Why climb down the ladder at all, Cuthbert, if the whole business could have been finished with a signature and a bank draft, and never touched me?" He looked at her, at the paper trembling in her hand, at 4 months of careful, unspoken devotion suddenly laid bare and made to look, in the space of a single document, like the worst kind of manipulation, rather than the thing he had told himself, every day since, it truly was, and found that the answer he owed her, the whole and honest shape of it, was too large and too old to be given properly in Pentland Vale's overfurnished parlor, in front of a solicitor and a gray ledger, and the very man who had driven them both to this reckoning. "Not here," he said, "not in front of him. I will tell you everything, Sibylla, every particular of it, I swear it to you, but not while that man is watching to see which of us breaks first." She stared at him a long moment, torn so visibly between fury and something gentler struggling beneath it, that he could not tell, watching her, whether she meant to strike him where he stood or take his hand, and it seemed, for one unbearable moment, that she herself did not know either. "Finish your business with him first, then," she said at last, low and unsteady, turning away from him toward the window, her back rigid, the paper still crushed in her fist. "Finish it, your Grace. I find I cannot stand in this room a moment longer deciding what I feel about a man I no longer know how much of at all." Vale, watching the exchange with open and undisguised satisfaction, rose from behind his table at last, plainly sensing that whatever fracture had just opened between husband and wife was worth more to him than any ledger. "How touching," he said, "to watch a marriage discover its own foundations mid-collapse. Perhaps, your Grace, the court will find the whole arrangement more irregular than I first supposed, a duke buying a family's freedom in secret, then marrying the daughter regardless, under a false name, for reasons he cannot even now bring himself to name aloud to her. It has rather the shape of a man covering one deception with another, does it not?" The Duke turned on him with a coldness that made the clerk near the door take an involuntary step backward. "You will find, Mr. Vale, that a man who has nothing left to hide is a far more dangerous adversary than one still guarding a secret, and you have just handed me the last piece I required to finish you cleanly. I would advise you to sit down and begin listing, in full, every note you hold against Mrs. Renshaw, because I intend to see the whole of this settled before either of us leaves this room, and I do not think you will care for the terms once my solicitor has finished reading that ledger through." Vale's confidence flickered, for the first time since they had entered, and he sat. It took the better part of 2 hours to finish Mr. Pentland Vale, and the Duke of Ilverdon found, doing it, that there was a cold satisfaction in the work entirely separate from the ache still sitting in his chest over Sibylla's silence at the window. The ledger, once the solicitor had gone through it line by line, told a story Vale had plainly never expected anyone with the standing to act on it to trouble to read. Interest compounded twice over on renewals that should have cancelled it. Notes altered after signing, the ink not quite matching. A second set of figures, kept separately, that did not agree with the first and would not. The solicitor observed dryly, bear much scrutiny from a magistrate, inclined to ask why a lender kept two ledgers for one debt. It was enough, laid end to end, not merely to discharge Mrs. Renshaw's obligation, but to threaten Vale's whole standing as a man of business in 3 counties. And the Duke made certain, before the morning was out, that every man in the market town whose good opinion Vale depended upon for his living would hear a plain, documented account of precisely how that living had been made. "You will discharge the whole of Mrs. Renshaw's debt as satisfied," the Duke said, when the reckoning was done and Vale sat gray-faced behind his own writing table. "And you will sign a statement, witnessed by your own clerk and my solicitor both, retracting every word you have spoken in this parish concerning the legitimacy of my marriage. In exchange, I will not lay this ledger before the assizes, though I confess it costs me something to extend you that mercy. You will also, Mr. Vale, cease entirely any further business with any member of the Renshaw family, on any pretext, for as long as we both shall live. Do you understand me?" "I understand you," Vale said, the words coming out thin and stripped of every ounce of the insolence he had worn on their arrival. "Good, then sign, and let us both be finished with each other." Vale, for his part, said nothing further as the documents were drawn and signed, watching the ruin of his own careful reputation assemble itself page by page across his own writing table, with the stunned, hollow silence of a man who has spent 30 years believing himself untouchable, and discovered, in the space of one bad morning, precisely how thin that belief had always been. When at last he set down the pen on the final page, his hand was not entirely steady, and he did not look up to watch the Duke and his solicitor gather the papers and take their leave. By that evening it was done, Mrs. Renshaw's debt cleared, and the papers to prove it lodged safely with a lawyer of the Duke's own choosing. Vale's retraction written and witnessed, and already, by the speed with which small-town gossip traveled, being repeated at the market towns, better dinner tables with considerable relish at his expense. Mrs. Renshaw herself, summoned that afternoon and told the whole of it in her own small parlor, had wept not with fear this time, but with a relief so complete it left her briefly unable to speak at all, and had clasped Sybilla's hands, and then the Duke's with equal, wordless gratitude before either of them could deflect it. But Sybylla had said almost nothing to him since the parlor. She had stood beside him through the whole long reckoning, correct and composed in front of Vale and the solicitors. But the moment they were alone she had gone quiet in a way that frightened him more than her earlier fury, had a careful, watchful silence, the silence of a woman still deciding what to do with a man who had, in the space of a single revealed page, become someone she was no longer certain she knew. They began the ride north the following morning, and it was not until the second day, somewhere on a long, empty stretch of road with Hob riding a discreet distance ahead, that she finally broke it. "Why did you climb down the ladder?" she asked, without preamble, her eyes fixed straight ahead on the road rather than on him. "That is the only question I have left, Cuthbert. Not why you kept it secret. I understand that well enough now, cowardice dressed as kindness, the same as it always is. I want to know why a duke who could have freed my mother with a signature chose, instead, to climb down a ladder and marry a stranger shouting at him from a churchyard wall. I have turned it over for 2 days, and I cannot make the pieces fit any story that does not frighten me." He was quiet a long moment, the horse's hooves loud on the frost-hard road, gathering not his courage but his honesty, which had proven, over 4 months, to be the harder of the two to summon. "Your father's name was Josiah Renshaw," he said finally. "He served under my command in Spain 11 years ago, a captain in my own regiment, and he pulled me out from under my dead horse at a river crossing that should by rights have killed me, at considerable risk to his own life, and never once in the years after asked me for anything in return for it. I wrote to him twice after I sold my commission. He never answered, and I let the correspondence lapse the way men do, and told myself there would be time later to properly repay a debt of that size. Then I learned 3 years ago that he had died, and I had never repaid it at all. Sibylla had gone very still beside him, listening now with her whole attention, the anger in her face giving way, slowly, to something else. "I came south to find his widow and his daughter," he went on, "and set right what I had let lapse too long to be comfortable admitting. I did not expect to find a girl shouting a marriage proposal from a churchyard wall before I had even made myself known to her. And when I climbed down that ladder, Sibylla, I told myself I was only being kind to a stranger in trouble, the way I ought to have been kind to her father years before I let the chance slip. It was only afterward on the road, watching you plan a school with candle stubs, listening to you recite scripture from memory, watching you argue a wool factor into submission over cold mutton, that I understood the truth had stopped being about your father entirely. I had begun, somewhere on that road, to love you for your own sake, not his, and by the time I understood that clearly enough to say it, I was already too much a coward to risk losing you by admitting how the whole thing had begun." It was 4 sentences in the end, once she made him strip it down afterward to its plainest bones. A debt, a death, a ladder climbed for a dead man's sake that became, before the marrying was even finished, something climbed for her sake instead. And it undid her more completely than any grander speech could have managed. "You loved my father enough to cross 3 counties for a debt he never once asked you to repay," she said, her voice unsteady now in an entirely different register than it had carried all week. "And you loved me enough, somewhere on that road, to be afraid of losing me more than you feared telling me the truth. That is not the same lie Vale accused you of in his parlor, Cuthbert. That is not cowardice dressed as kindness at all." "Is it not?" "No," she said, and reached across the small space between the horses to take his hand, her fingers cold but no longer trembling, steady now in a way that told him, before she said another word, exactly what she had decided. "It is a man who did not know how to say the truest thing he had ever felt, because he had never once in his life been given reason to believe anyone would want to hear it. I know something of that particular silence, Your Grace. I have been keeping my own small griefs quiet for a great deal longer than 4 months, for much the same reason." He turned his hand beneath hers, closing his fingers around it, and for the first time since the parlor felt something in his chest ease that he had not realized, until that moment, had been holding its breath for 2 full days. "Then we are neither of us very good at this," he said. "But I find I would rather practice being honest with you badly than be silently kind to you well, for the whole of whatever years we are given." "That," Sibylla said, the ghost of her old dry humor finally surfacing again, "is the first entirely honest thing you have said to me since a wet churchyard, and I find, Cuthbert Ray, that I have missed hearing it a great deal more than I let myself admit these last 2 days." They rode on in a silence that was, for the first time in 2 days, an easy one, and it was nearly an hour before either spoke again. "There is one more thing I have not told you," he said at last, and felt her hand tense briefly in his before he hurried to finish it. "Nothing so grave as the last, I promise you. Only that I wrote to Rector Bray before we ever left for the south, asking whether he would consider a living at Ilverdon, should he ever tire of Draycott Renshaw's damp winters. He wrote back 3 days ago. He means to come north in the spring, once his successor is found, and he asked, in the same letter, whether the parish church roof at Ilverdon wanted mending, since he had heard the present Duke had some small talent in that direction. Sibylla laughed, a real laugh, startled out of her, the first since the parlor, and something in the sound of it, carrying clear across the frosted fields, felt to him like the first true thaw after a long, hard winter neither of them had been entirely certain would end. "Then you had best find a ladder," she said, "before he arrives to hold you to it." Spring came late to Ilverdon that year, but when it came all at once, snowmelt roaring down off the fells into the river, the parkland going green almost overnight, and the east wing of the house, scaffolded for so long the Duke had nearly stopped seeing the scaffolding at all, finally standing bare and whole, and slated from end to end for the first time in a generation. He stood in the forecourt on the morning the last board came down, arms folded, watching the workmen coil their ropes and carry the trestles away, and felt something settle in his chest that he had not expected repairing a roof could produce. Not merely satisfaction at a debt finally discharged, though there was that too, but something closer to the quiet pride of a man watching a promise, long deferred, finally kept in full. "It looks," Sibylla said, coming to stand beside him with her shawl pulled close against the morning chill, "like a house someone actually lives in now, rather than a ruin someone is merely enduring. It took long enough. Most things worth having do." She slipped her arm through his, an easy, unremarkable gesture now after 8 months of marriage, though he still felt the small warmth of it every time as though it were new. "Mrs. Alcombe tells me the roses your mother planted along the south wall have survived the winter after all. She thought them lost 2 years running. It seems some things are hardier than anyone gives them credit for being." He looked down at her chalk dust no longer novel on her sleeve, the sharp, clever face he had first seen shouting from a churchyard wall now easy and unguarded in a way it had not been that wet morning 11 months before, and thought, not for the first time that spring, that he had climbed down a ladder to repay one debt, and found himself, by the time he reached the ground, owing an entirely different and far larger one, that he suspected he would spend the whole rest of his life gladly failing to fully discharge. A letter had come from Mrs. Renshaw that same week, her hand steadier now than it had been in years, full of news of a small cottage taken near her sister's in the south, of a garden she meant to plant come the warmer weather, of a peace in her days she wrote of almost shyly, as though still not entirely trusting it would hold. She had closed the letter, as she closed every letter now, with a line of blessing for them both that never failed to catch the Duke somewhere beneath the ribs when Sibylla read it aloud to him over breakfast. A woman who had once faced ruin with nothing but a frightened daughter's desperate scheme to shield her, now safe enough to write of roses. The school, by that spring, had outgrown the old laundry entirely. Sibylla had converted a disused gallery in the east wing instead, bright now with new glass and freshly plastered walls, and on the morning the roof was finished she led him there herself, insisting he come and see before he returned to his own work, and he stood in the doorway and counted, without quite meaning to, 19 children bent over their slates, Holly's youngest among them, and the shy shepherd's boy from the laundry days grown a full head taller and reading aloud now, haltingly but with real pride, from a battered primer. 19, he said quietly, watching her move between the rows, correcting a grip on a chalk here, praising a well-formed letter there, entirely in her element in a way that still, after 8 months, caught at something unguarded in his chest every time he watched her at it. 19, she agreed, coming back to stand beside him at the door. "We shall want a second room by autumn, and I have already written to your steward about it, so you need not trouble yourself pretending to be surprised when the estimate arrives on your desk." "I would not dream of pretending anything with you, madam. I have learned my lesson thoroughly on that account." "So you claim," she said, with the dry, familiar humor that had become, over 8 months, one of the things he most looked forward to in any given day. Though I notice you have still not told me what you and Rector Bray were conspiring over in the estate office last week with the door closed. That, he said, is not deception. That is merely a surprise, and there is a considerable difference, whatever argument you care to make otherwise. Rector Bray arrived, as promised, in the first full week of May, his belongings following in a cart behind him and his manor. On stepping down into the Ilverdon forecourt, that of a man well pleased with his own foresight in having secured, months before, a living attached to a duke who was known to keep his word. He took one look at the church tower rising beyond the park wall, its own roof still patched with the temporary work the duke had left half-finished the previous autumn in favor of the house, and declared, within the hour of his arrival, that he intended to see it properly mended before he preached his first sermon from beneath it. "I did not come north," Bray said, standing in the forecourt with his hands on his hips, surveying the church roof with the frank, assessing eye of a man who had once watched a duke climb down a ladder in a laborer's coat and had never entirely stopped finding the memory amusing. "To preach beneath a roof I would not trust to keep out a hard rain. You mended one for me once, your grace, under rather more complicated circumstances than the present ones. I find myself hoping you have not lost the knack." It was, the Duke understood, both a genuine request and a small, gentle joke at his own expense, offered by a man who had kept a considerable secret for nearly a year without once using it to his own advantage. And he found he did not mind in the least being teased for it now that the secret no longer needed keeping. He thought, watching Bray direct the unloading of his own modest belongings, with the brisk good humor of a man settling gladly into a life he had chosen, of how much of the past year's trouble had grown from silences he alone had kept, and how little trouble, by contrast, had ever come from the truths he had finally learned to speak aloud. It was, he had come to think, the plainest lesson the whole strange business had taught him, that a man might guard his heart for 30 years believing the guarding a kind of strength, and discover only very late, and only through a woman brave enough to shout her whole desperate self up a churchyard wall, that the greater courage lay in setting the guard down. "I have not lost the knack," he said, "though I find I no longer climb ladders unsupervised. My wife has opinions about it." "Your wife," Bray said, glancing toward Sibylla, who had come out onto the forecourt steps to see what the commotion concerned, "strikes me as a woman with opinions about a great many things, most of them sound ones. I shall leave the two of you to settle the matter of the ladder between yourselves." He did not have to wait long to find out how it would settle. 3 days later, standing in the churchyard with a fresh bundle of slate, and the old ladder propped once more against the tower wall, the Duke of Ilverdon found his wife had reached the same conclusion he had, and had simply arrived at it a full 10 minutes before he had finished tying off the rope. "I am going up," she announced, already testing the first rung with the same brisk, unhesitating confidence she had once brought to a churchyard proposal, her skirts already gathered and pinned out of the way in a manner that suggested this was not a decision open to negotiation. "You are not going up a church roof, Sibylla. I have watched you do it a dozen times this spring, and it does not appear especially difficult, provided one does not look down overlong, and I should like, just once, to see this parish from the height you saw it from the very first morning I ever shouted up at you." She was already 3 rungs up, her voice carrying back down clear and unbothered by his protest. "You may hold the ladder steady if it eases your mind, your grace. I do not require your permission, only your assistance, and I find those are 2 very different things." He could have insisted. A year ago he might well have. Instead, he crossed to the foot of the ladder, gathered the bundle of slate she had abandoned on the grass, and set both hands to the rails to hold it fast, watching her climb with her chin lifted at that same defiant angle, unafraid, entirely herself. Exactly the woman who had once shouted the whole of her desperate courage up at a stranger and refused to be talked out of it. "Are you coming down?" he called after her, not because he wanted her to, but because it seemed, given the history between them, the proper thing to ask. "No," she called back, laughing, already settling herself against the tower's warm stone in the strengthening spring sun, looking out over the green valley that had once frightened her from a ridge and now, plainly, felt entirely like home. "I do not believe I am coming down at all, sir. I find I like the view a great deal too well from up here to give it up so easily." He stood at the foot of the ladder, slate in his arms, sun warm on his shoulders, and looked up at his wife perched happily against the old stone tower where a whole improbable year had begun, and found, standing there, that he had never once in 33 years felt so entirely and undeservedly fortunate as he did now, holding a ladder steady beneath a woman who had married a stranger to save her mother and stayed, in the end, to save him instead, and looking, for perhaps the first time in his guarded, careful life, exactly like a man who knew he had got away with something far better than he had ever thought himself owed.